So we'll be going, we have 3 papers, so we'll be going for another hour and 20 minutes from now, wherever you are in the world. So 10 to 6 for me in the Netherlands. Oh, no, sorry, 10 to 6 in the UK, 10 to 7 in the Netherlands, and 10 to something else, wherever you are. And we'll keep questions for after the papers. Or maybe not even 10 to, but obviously there's half hour time. So we'll keep questions for after the 3 papers. You can send me questions in the chat as well. For presenters, I'm going to send you a message in the chat when you've got 2 minutes left. So when you had 80 minutes. So hopefully we'll have enough time for questions afterwards. Okay, so our first speaker is Nasim Basiri. Nasim is a poet, PhD student, and a graduate teaching assistant in women, gender, and sexuality studies at Oregon State University. Her forthcoming publications include Religious Hypocrisy of Clerics in the Form of Temporary Marriages, which has won the University of North Carolina's Firdausi Tulsi Award for Persian Literature and Culture in 2020. She's also the co-founder of the Commission on Transnational Feminisms and Queer Politics at the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnographical Sciences, which has organized several conferences and webinars. And she has also published opinion pieces on women's issues in the Middle East and Iran in various international media outlets. Her paper today is Rethinking Queering in the Pre-Modern Persian Poetry, a dialogue between Rūmī and Ḥāfeẓ-e Shīrāzī. Thanks, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Simon. There's a few changes in the biography, but I don't want to correct it right now. Thank you so much. So as you know, my paper is on rethinking queering in the pre-modern Persian poetry, a dialogue between Rūmī and Ḥāfeẓ-e Shīrāzī. Well, I think we cannot establish that dialogue in 20 minutes here, but I try to make some connections between these 2 poets, if I have time. So as we know, Third World history, the MENA history in general, and pre-modern and modern Iranian history in particular has left little room for women and like LGBTQ people in their historical accounts, whether it is in theology or even in literature. These identities has also been historically marginalized, excluded, and underrepresented in academic intellectual disciplines such as literature or religious studies, to name a few. And as a result, the history of Persian LGBTQ people have remained orphaned. And recent research on pre-modern Persian poetry shows us that from 9th century onwards, which is known as the dawn of Persian poetry, to the 20th century, homosexuality has not been overlooked in Persian poetry, but also homoeroticism brought into being almost the only amatory subjects of Persian ghazals or ghazals. Even though homosexuality in pre-modern Persian poetry is a topic which really deserves, I think, more attention, but I personally could not find enough resources on this topic in Persian language. And I think we all know that in post-revolutionary Iran, the censorships does not allow that like books or publications around LGBTQ people or even feminist issues get published. So, and also due to the homophobic nature of the governance, where patriarchy and homophobia finds their way to literary movements, even until today, which exclude women and LGBTQ people, not only from their literary publications and historiography, but also from history and historicization. So this is a very new topic, and we are in the beginning of its road. Of course, a male-dominated and homophobic historiography and literary culture has always existed in a place like Iran or other Middle Eastern countries, but things are changing recently as we're, seeing rooms for optimism in the horizon, such as this kind of conferences that are being organized on MENA and MENA literature. Persian queer poetry, I think, has been a victim of Eurocentrism, homophobia, and also religious fanaticism. And in recent decades, queer identities in pre-modern Persian poetry have been examined and identified but highlighting issues around sexuality and gender has been rarely done by literary scholars, particularly on Persian poetry, queer poetry. Then in this paper, I'm trying to re-examine and reread two pre-modern Persian poets' works, which is Jalaluddin Muhammad Rūmī Balkhi, 13th century, and Khwaja Shamsuddin Muhammad Ḥāfeẓ-e Shīrāzī, which is known by Ḥāfeẓ-e Shīrāzī, the 14th century, as a way of re-examining, deconstructing, and historicizing the literary figures with diverse identities. And then we're trying to save the pre-modern Iranian queer poetry from marginalization through synthesizing the pre-modern Persian poetry to comparative literature. And then look at the homoerotic representations in Ḥāfeẓ and Rūmī as a way of exploring the world and worlds of non-normative poets, or maybe introducing some new possibilities of reading queerness in MENA literature. So a few instances of the queerness of Rūmī and Ḥāfeż's poetry are, and I personally decided to bring a few examples of already published works on pre-modern and modern Iranian queer poetry in English and Persian. And I did that because I wanted to avoid the potential biases I might have in the interpretations of the poem. So these poems are already being interpreted by other scholars, and I'm using them here. When it comes to Ḥāfeẓ, Sirus Shamsiya argues that undoubtedly the beloved of Ḥāfeẓ poems is male, like poets of all times. Queer literary tradition was so common in the time of Ḥāfeẓ or in Ḥāfeẓ era to an extent that he could describe the king as a beloved. And Ḥāfeẓ directly talks about male beloved in his poems. Actually, it was really common thing in those times between Sufi poets and Sufi scholars. So in one of his poems, Ḥāfeẓ says, دل من در هوای روی فرخ بود آشفته همچون موی فرخ به جز هندوی زلفش هیچ کس نیست که برخوردار شد از روی فرخ. So here Ḥāfeẓ literally describes his love and praising Farrokh, which Farrokh historically is a male in Persian language. And then Ḥāfeẓ here tries to describe, I will try to share the screen here, maybe. Okay. Okay, here, and unfortunately, because I was sick, I couldn't translate it. I was supposed to this week, but I can embed them to my paper. And so here, Farrokh is there, and if you just take a look at other Ḥāfeż's poems, you will see that he directly talks about a male beloved and not a female beloved. Then there are some other poems. I'm just gonna do my document here. Like خوشا شیراز از خوشا شیراز و بیبالش خداوندا نگه دار از زوالش ز رکن آباد ما صد لوحش الله که عمر خضر میبخشد زلالش. It goes calls him a sweet voice and says گر آن شیرین پسر خونم بریزد دلا چون شیر مادر کن حلالش. So Ḥāfeẓ loves this شیرین پسر or the sweet boy to an extent that he's ready to give his life to that sweet boy. And the beloved itself has a different meaning in classical Persian poetry, maybe not a different meaning, but when it's used with the right, you know, with the adjectives and with the nouns that they are being used in those era, in those times, for men, not for women, we can actually see that Ḥāfeẓ or Sa'di or Rūmī, for example, they are talking or they're describing a male, not a female. So on the meaning of beloved, Ehsan Yarşater argues that in early and mid-classical poetry, particularly in their lyrical preludes, the beloved is sometimes a young person, a youth who serves as a page, but more often a young Turkish soldier. And I think it's believed that you know, Turks actually made homosexuality kind of normal and accepted in Iran. Like these Turkish soldiers brought that culture. Of course, homosexuality already existed in Iran, but people were not that much open about it, especially the Sufi poets. From the early, in the Abbasid period, the Khalifa instituted a tradition of forming army contingents composed of the slaves, mostly taken as captives in the course of frontier wars and raid into Central Asia, Yarşater argues, and in India, among the other regions. There were also slave markets where young male slaves, along with female ones, captured at booty or procured by other means, were sold. And then it is also, I think, in Barde and Bardedari, Slave and Slavery by Ehsan Yarşater. So I'm just gonna skip this because I cannot talk fast today, but yeah, here, sorry about that. Sorry, I think I lost it. And then, you know, all of it, they were trying to say that homosexuality in those days, it was very much accepted. It was not like now. And I think Afsaneh Najmabadi also argues that, you know, homosexuality already existed in Iran. And, you know, in 19th century, there are accounts of you know, homosexuality that Najmabadi brings that in her book, Women with Mustache, Men with Beard, I think. And then Shamsia, which is an Iranian scholar, and he's the only scholar that is written on homosexuality in Persian literature, I think, in Iran, and his book is banned, refers to Zarrin Kub's description of homosexuality in Ḥāfeẓ era and also in Sa'di era, that homosexuality was common in those days, that every empty corner, and this is Zarrin Kub's words, which is an Iranian historian, homosexuality was so common in those days that every empty corner of the madrasa was witnessing it. And Turkish rulers of that era were famous for being homosexual. So this is another proof from Zarrin Kub, which is one of the prominent scholars of Iranian history. During my visit to Konya in 2018, I had a chance to visit Rūmī's tomb and visiting dervishes and attending their events. Also the poets there in Konya, I heard different narratives. One group of, you know, those people that I was talking to, they believe that Rūmī's love poems were written for his beloved Shams Tabrizi, who they believe Rūmī was in love with him, and the other group completely ignored this narrative. So there are different narratives even in Konya. which is the city of Rūmī. However, if we take a close look at Rūmī's love poems, we would see that Rūmī's beloved is also a male, and we also know that, you know, I think maybe those who are interested in Rūmī's story, which everybody I think in the West and East know about Rūmī. They know the narratives and the story of Rūmī and Shams Tabrizi. Anyways, I'm just losing this. Yeah, there is another poem that I tried to choose and bring it here for this presentation. Rūmī says, ای یوسف خوشنام ما خوش می روی بر بام ما، ای در شکست جام ما، ای بردریده دام ما، ای نور ما، ای سور ما، ای دولت منصور ما. And again, I didn't translate this. I'm so sorry, but I will put the translation later on in the paper. And I hope you get to read it. So again, Rūmī talks about Yusuf, and Yusuf again is a male, and there are many critics talk about Rūmī's longing for Shams Tabrizi when they were separated, and they believe that most of the love poems of Rūmī are dedicated to Shams. Anyways, I think there were a lot of ties between Sufi poets and dervishes, like emotional ties. And Helmut Ritter also talks about it, talk about the love relations of the Sufis more generally, especially about the Islamic mystics. And I think, sorry, I'm just trying to add this here. They had so many social and legal ties as well, what the history shows. Then some Sufis also, they went so far as to believe that God takes up residence in people, especially in the beautiful people. And I think Ritter, Helmut Ritter talks about it. They believe that God takes up residence in people, especially in beautiful people, and it's possible for those Sufis to see and worship the God, you know, here and now, as Ritter states. So there are so many evidences that people or poets like Saadi or Ḥāfeẓ and Rūmī were homosexual poets, and the love poems that they wrote were actually for men. But unfortunately, there is, you know, a few research on that, and you know, most of the researches that take place in Iran, especially, they're not allowed to focus on homosexuality in poetry, even in recent era or even in contemporary times. So as a result, it's like kind of a taboo to talk about homosexuality in poetry, and this kind of excludes and marginalizes the LGBTQ people in general and their poetry and their literature, which is kind of their history. So it's kind of like removing LGBTQ people from history through marginalizing and silencing their voices. I will finish with reading this poem by Rūmī, Who is at my door? He said, who is at my door? I said, your humble servant. He said, what business do you have? I said, to greet you, O Lord. He said, how long will you journey on? I said, until you stop me. He said, how long will you boil in the fire? I said, until I am pure. This is my all of love. For the sake of love, I gave up wealth and position. He said, you have pleaded your case, but you have no witness. I said, my tears are my witness. The pallor of my face is my proof. He said, your witness has no credibility. Your eyes are too wet to see. I said, by splendor of your justice, my eyes are clear, faultless. He said, what do you seek? I said, to have you as my constant friend. He said, what do you want from me? I said, your abundant grace. He said, who was your companion on the journey? I said, the thought of you, O king. He said, what called you here? I said, the fragrance of your wine. He said, what brings you the most fulfillment? I said, the company of the emperor. And here you see that they always praise the kings as well. He said, what do you find there? I said, 100 miracles. He said, why is the palace deserted? I said, they all fear the thief. He said, who is the thief? I said, the one who keeps me from you. He said, where is the safety? I said, in the service of renunciation. And it goes on. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasim. It was a great paper and very thought-provoking. For anyone who's joined in the meantime, we're going to leave questions until until after the three papers. So great. So we'll move, if we can, on to the next paper now. So our next speaker is Professor Talya Fishman. Professor Fishman is Associate Professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania. She's published widely on the cultures of medieval and early modern Jews within their broader Christian and Muslim context. She's the author of 2 monographs and numerous articles and chapters, and has lectured around the world. Publications that explore Jewish cultural developments within the medieval Islamic world include Guarding Oral Transmission Within and Between Cultures, and that's in Oral Tradition in 2010. And she has co-edited a volume titled Regional Identities and Cultures of Medieval Jews, and that's Oxford 2018, in which she has a chapter called In Our Talmud Tradition, and the Predilection for Works of Applied Law in Early Sephardic Rabbinic Culture. Her paper today is slightly different from the program. It's called 10th Century Rabbinites on the Formation of Judaism's Foundational Corpora, the Medieval Islamic World, and the Perspective of the Longue Durée. Thanks, Talya. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Nasim, for your impassioned delivery. I enjoyed it very much. Okay, very different topic, but
thank you. I think I was not passionate today because I am very sick. I don't know what I'm saying.
my first encounter with you suggests otherwise. So
thank you. I'm
so again, the title is 10th Century Rabbinites on the Formation of Judaism's Foundational Corpora, the Medieval Islamicate World and the Perspective of the Longue Durée. Not unlike their Muslim counterparts, Jewish scholars of the early Islamicate world subjected their own foundational bodies of knowledge to analytical scrutiny. Focus on the written Torah was manifest in the new methodical study of the Hebrew language and in the compilation and writings of the Masorah, an orally transmitted corpus whose details anchored the spelling, pronunciation, and syntax of scripture's unvocalized and unpunctuated text. The analytical approach to oral Torah, a category invented by the rabbis encompassing Midrash, Mishnah, and Talmud, led to the systematization of Jewish jurisprudence in the very environment where Abbasid scholars were producing an Islamic legal system to unify and govern the geographically vast and ethnically diverse Ummah. The new focus on Judaism's bedrock sources also gave rise to unprecedented reflections on their compositional origins. In this study, I will discuss disparate portraits of the formation of Judaism's seminal sources presented by two towering Rabbinite scholars of the 10th century, Saadia ben Yosef al-Fayyumi, 882 to 892 to 942, and Shrira ben Hanina, 906 to 1006. Though they did not serve coterminously, both were Gaonim, or eminences, leaders of the post-Talmudic Iraqi academies at Sura and Pumbedita, respectively, and the preeminent Rabbinite legal authorities of their time. Both Gaonim were acutely aware of developments in the surrounding Islamic culture, and both were rationalists of Mutazilite orientation. Notwithstanding these similarities, Shrira's views on the formation of scripture and Mishnah diverged dramatically from those of Saadia, which he undoubtedly knew. To explore possible reasons for their conflicting narratives, I set these Gaonic claims both in their synchronic context, highlighting affinities with Islamic cultural perspectives, and in the diachronic context of earlier Jewish writings, building on Gregor Scholle's study of the polar attitudes toward the writing of Hadith that were held as late as the 10th century by traditionists of Syria and Iraq. This study sheds light on the prehistory of a geocultural divide that found expression in the perspectives of medieval Jews and Muslims alike. For a similar mapping of orientations can be found in older rabbinic writings from the Roman and Sasanian empires. Scholle's observations about Hellenistic culture's lingering impact on the medieval Islamicate world can thus be complemented by conjectures about the endurance of Zoroastrian perspectives. But if the perspectives of the longue durée points to the persistence of regionally distinct assumptions about writing and their related practices and its related practices, it does not efface awareness that perduring cultural continuities were brought to the fore by specific historical, social, and political circumstances under which these continuities came to convey new meanings. Two preliminary remarks. One, in their own ways, each of the Gaonic claims examined here placed the compositional dimensions of Torah and rabbinic writings on a common footing. This agenda contrasts sharply with that of ancient rabbis who labored to establish boundaries between the two corpora. Concerned to prevent slippage between the two authoritative bodies of knowledge, 3rd century sages mandated distinctive performative treatments for each. In a two-pronged dictum, they decreed that transmission of what they called written matters, that is Torah, was not to be undertaken unless its text was liturgically read from an unfurled scroll. By contrast, oral matters, which included the rabbinic corpora along with the Targum, the Aramaic translation of Hebrew Bible, could only be orally imparted. Anyone communicating such teachings was forbidden to read them from a written text. The logic behind this dictum becomes clear when set at its particular time and place. The temple's destruction in 70 CE had precipitated a vacuum in Jewish leadership, and as but a small subset of Palestine's Jewish population, the rabbis competed with others for the mantle of authority. As some rivals claimed new teachings of divine inspiration or origin, the Book of Jubilees and the Enochic Revelations, for example, rabbis attempted to delegitimize them by declaring that prophecy had ceased with the temple's destruction and by laboring to canonize scripture, erecting distinct and impenetrable boundaries around its far older traditions. The dictum's presentation of written and oral matters as parallel categories also enabled the rabbis to place their own teachings on a footing equal to that of God's word. While the modalities of their transmission were different, the content of these sources was of equal authority. My second preliminary point. In their respective framings of the commonality of Judaism's two foundational bodies of knowledge, Mishnah, as the source of all post-biblical law, stands for more than itself. It is a metonym for rabbinic tradition in general. Talmud, after all, is a commentary on the Mishnah. Beyond this, in the time of Saadia and Shriira, the Talmud, though dialogically stable, may not have been lexically fixed, as the Mishnah clearly was. The body of my remarks. Saadia ben Yosef only became the Gaon of the Babylonian yeshiva of Sura after a childhood in Egypt and years of study in Tiberias, center of Masoretic activity and site of a school where Muslims training to serve as bureaucratic administrators received a broad education in subjects allied with Arabic literature. Hellenistic assumptions about writing, to be discussed below, persisted in the Islamicate Paideia of Syria, a region that had formerly been under Roman rule. For this reason, I present Saadia's worldview as one shaped in large measure by his exposure in Tiberias to these text and writing-centered disciplines. Saadia's pioneering compositions in the fields of Hebrew lexicography, philology, grammar, and scriptural exegesis, among others, bear witness to this formative experience. These were not disciplines cultivated by the Iraqi-born Babylonian Gaonim. In several of his writings, Saadia surveyed the history of Jewish knowledge and reflected on the processes that had resulted in the formation of both written and oral Torah. Strikingly, he ascribed similar prehistories to both. In his Judeo-Arabic commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, an enigmatic Hebrew cosmogonic treatise of uncertain dating and provenance, Saadia wrote that its contents, and I rely here on the Hebrew translation of Rabbi Yosef Kafi, were unceasingly transmitted within our nation in an unwritten form, as the Mishnah was transmitted in unwritten form, close quote. Here, Saadia interjects that parts of scripture itself had a similar prehistory, and he cites Proverbs 25:1, quote, "These also are the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, transmitted," close quote. As these two Davidic kings were 12 generations apart, Saadia made this observation, quote, "And even some of scripture was for many years transmitted and not written as in the Proverbs of Solomon," close quote. Turning back to his discussion of the Mishnah's formation, Saadia referred to an unnamed, quote, "time when the nation's sages gathered and they compiled, perhaps concentrated the matters of the Mishnah, and they garbed them in their own words and fixed them," close quote. The anxiety of ancient rabbis to prevent slippage between written and oral Torah was not Saadia's concern. At a time when Karaites, Jewish scripturalists of the medieval Islamicate world, were attacking rabbinic authority and the very conceit of oral Torah, Saadia proclaimed the non-self-sufficiency of scripture. Think Shafi'i. Not only could Hebrew Bible not be understood without recourse to the traditions given orally at Sinai, he asserted, even scriptural mandates for Jewish practice needed the explanatory instructions of the rabbis in order to be implemented. In short, as the arch anti-Karaite polemicist, Saadia had clear reasons for placing oral Torah on a continuum with written Torah. The manner in which he did so bears close resemblance to Muslim narratives regarding the formation of Quran and Hadith. In describing the standardization of the Mus'haf, the written manifestation of the Book of God around the year 650 at the behest of the Umayyad Caliph Uthman, both a Hadith and 9th century Muslim narratives recount the collection and registration in writing of Quranic revelations that had been preserved in memory and in written memoranda. According to Islamic tradition, Tadwin al-Hadith, the first official collection of the Prophet's sayings and deeds, ordered sometime between 717 and 720 by the Umayyad Caliph Umar II, involved the same processes. As Gregor Scholler noted, Muslim tradition portrays Umar II as having played the role for Hadith that Uthman played for Quran. Though he knew the writings of Saadia, Shīrāzī Gaon presented a very different conception of Rabbinic Judaism's compositional origins in his epistle to the Jews of Kairouan, written in 987. Not unlike Saadia, Shīrāzī likened the formation of Mishnah to the formation of scripture. But where Saadia had written that oral Torah and at least parts of written Torah were the products of an identical compositional process, one undertaken by humans, Shīrāzī brought Mishnah into the ambit of revealed teachings. In an earlier study, I drew attention to the cluster of claims whereby Shīrāzī sought to frame Mishnah as an inimitable composition produced with divine assistance. I argued that Shīrāzī's description of the preternaturally fortuitous circumstances of its compilation and his rhapsodic paeans to the eloquence of its language both appropriated and transposed contemporary Islamic arguments for the Quran's inimitability. Shīrāzī was not wrong in assuming that Jewish readers of the Aramaic epistle would recognize these literary and theological markers of inimitability, for while generally deployed to suppress rival Arabic texts, the doctrine of Ijaz al-Quran also played a role in critiques of Hebrew scripture. Thus, while Jewish familiarity with this doctrine is easily explained, Shīrāzī's presumption that Jewish readers were at some level envious of this Muslim doctrine is striking. Were this not the case, there would have been little point in informing them that the foundational compilation of rabbinic law bore these same markers of inimitability. While Shīrāzī and other Gaonim did have access to chronologies of earlier generations of Jews, his claims about the Mishnah, like certain other narratives in the epistle, were fabricated out of whole cloth. What work was the Ijazification of Mishnah intended to accomplish? In my earlier study, I raised two possibilities. It may have been designed to parry the Karaite denigration of rabbinic teachings as but, quote, the teachings of man, or it may have provided Rabbinite Jews with a defense against Muslim disparagement of the Mishnah. Traditionists who objected to the writing of Hadith cited the Jews' submission to a book other than the Book of God as a cautionary tale. Adding to these conjectures, I would now suggest that Shīrāzī's unprecedented claims about the Mishnah were part of a rearguard battle against the textualization of rabbinic culture at a time when the Gaonite was declining. Ironically, the Gaonim themselves had contributed to this very development by sending written sections of the Babylonian Talmud to Jewish communities west of Iraq. Once equipped with these written texts, Rabbinite scholars far from the yeshivot, the academies, were able to provide legal guidance for their own communities, relying less on the Gaonim. Shīrāzī's ultimately unsuccessful attempt to halt this creeping development is manifest first and foremost in the epistle's reply to the Jews of Kairouan. In response to their cluster of questions requesting clarification of the circumstances under which rabbinic Judaism's constituent sources had been written, Shīrāzī disabused them of their very assumption and declared that none were written. Given his well-deserved concerns about the dwindling authority of the Gaonim, I suggest that his attempt to Ijazify Mishnah may have been a last-ditch effort to enhance the status of oral transmission and imbue it with an aura of sacrality. The claim that Mishnah was produced with assistance from on high created a strong association between oral tradition and the transcendent. I suggest that the forging of this link enhanced the authority of the Gaonim. Of course, they did not and would not claim to be spokesmen for God, given the rabbinic position that prophecy had ceased and the complicated ruminations on post-biblical prophecy in the Islamicate world dominated by a revelation of faith. Yet Gaonim did understand themselves as living links in an unbroken chain of oral transmission, heirs to the Talmudic sages of 3rd through 6th century Babylonia and figurative occupants of their very seats. This self-understanding went hand in hand with the Gaonic belief that the orally transmitted sacred content of rabbinic tradition was far superior to any historically contingent formulation, a perspective not unlike that articulated by Muslim scholars who were critical of the standardization of the Mus'haf. Shīrāzī's framing of Mishnah, the first composition of oral law and an oral corpus, as a work produced with divine assistance, reinforced the idea that sacrality inhered in unwritten traditions and in its bearers. What accounted for the gap between the views of Saadia and Shīrāzī? As I see it, Shīrāzī's lionization of oral transmission aligns with the perspective of the Iraqi traditionists who vehemently opposed the writing of hadith. I have already presented my reasons for framing Saadia's orientation as consonant with that of learned Muslims of Syro-Palestine. By construing their differences then as shaped at least in part by region, it becomes possible to situate these 10th century sources relative to earlier Jewish evidence of geographically divergent attitudes toward writing. Yair Furstenberg recently studied the two-pronged dictum discussed above, and tracing its roots back to the Second Temple period, he demonstrated that its initial Palestinian purpose, namely the safeguarding of Scripture's boundaries, was overridden by Babylonian Amoraim of a later generation, who imposed on it their own agenda and prohibited any consignment of oral matters to writing. Furstenberg, along with Iranologists Shaul Shakeh, Yaakov Elman, and Shai Sekunda, have surmised that the opposition to writing expressed by 3rd through 6th century Babylonian rabbis of the Sasanian Empire reflected attitudes found in their broader culture. There, the commitment to preserving the sacred teachings in oral form was so zealously observed that Zoroastrianism's sacred book, the Avesta, and the oral law of its sages, the Chastag, were only consigned to writing in the 6th century as the Sasanian Empire came to an end. If in Sasanian Babylonia, oral transmission was designed to conceal information from the unworthy, the understanding of oral transmission that prevailed in the Roman Empire was part and parcel of the Hellenistic distinction between two categories of writing, the syngrama and the hypomnema. The term syngrama designated a standalone composition of any genre, for example, royal edicts executed by scribes, or redacted treatises on any topic that were structured and fully redacted in accordance with specific stylistic rules. Such writings were those that their authors deemed complete and ready for unrestricted circulation. By contrast, the term hypomnema referred to a writing that had not undergone final redaction and was not to be widely disseminated. Aide-memoire, such as the lecture notes a scholar consulted prior to delivery of a lesson, or the notes taken by students, fell within this category. So did commentaries, for in successive classroom cycles, an instructor was likely to alter his remarks on an established text. Even when circulated within limited circles in written form, hypomnemata resisted closure. These unfinished writings were subject to alteration and pregnant with possibility, inviting further conversation, response, and revision. The rabbis availed themselves of the syngrama hypomnema binary in formulating the above-mentioned dictum. Of course, Torah was Judaism's paradigmatic syngrama. It populated the category of written matters, while the category oral matters was applied to the Targum, the Hebrew Bible's Aramaic translation, along with the corpora of oral Torah, that is Midrash, Mishnah, and the Talmuds. All but Mishnah are easily recognizable as hypomnemata. For Targum, which is not merely a translation of scripture, and Midrash both supply commentary on the Torah, as Talmud supplies commentary on the Mishnah. The dictum mandating a visible difference between the transmission of written and oral matters did not prohibit the consignment of non-revealed knowledge to writing. Indeed, rabbinic teachings themselves indicate that written instantiations of, quote, oral matters existed in Palestine. Leaving aside the very interesting question of terminology, medieval Jews and Muslims who lived in regions shaped by ancient Hellenistic assumptions and practices also distinguished polished writings from works in progress that were not ready for general release. Indeed, the distinction between memoranda written to jog the memory, what the Greeks would have called hypomnemata, and fully redacted works, the end products of lengthy processes that might include compilation, consignment to writing, sequencing, and the insertion of editorial interventions that would render the text's meaning more accessible to readers. In other words, what the Greeks would have called syngramata. This distinction lies at the heart of the Muslim accounts of the formation of the Mus'haf and of Tadwin al-Hadith. It is also present in Saadia's remarks on the formation of Mishnah and parts of written Torah, and in writings by medieval Karaite and Rabbinite Bible exegetes of both Islamic and Byzantine lands. These lands which were both heirs to Hellenistic culture, these exegetes drew attention to the interventions of the human redactor, the former, those in the Islamic world, designating this editor as the Mudawwin, while the latter used the term Sadran, Hebrew for arranger. Living in an area that had been part of the erstwhile Sasanian Empire, Muslims and Jews of Abbasid Iraq appear to have perpetuated a regional aversion to consigning knowledge deemed oral to writing. It may be no coincidence that the traditionists who held out longest in opposing the writing of hadith were from Kufa and Basra, cities near the Iranian province of Pars, which was the center of Zoroastrianism in post-Sasanian times. But if this resistance drew or capitalized on latent regional proclivities, it was also an expression of Abbasid-Umayyad rivalry. As Scholler pointed out, hostility to the Tadween project that had been ordered by the Umayyad Caliph went hand in hand with disparagement of the hadith bearers in his domain. They were far inferior to those of Kufa and Basra, who were renowned for their superior powers of memorization. If a particular Hebrew testimony of the 9th century can be believed, Iraqi rabbinites accused their Palestinian counterparts of inappropriately relying on texts of oral traditions as early as 760. As in the case of the Iraqi traditionists, intense political rivalry triggered the weaponization of deeply rooted regional attitudes. The conflict in this case was not between Muslim dynasties, but between the Babylonian and Palestinian centers of Jewish life, with the Iraqi rabbinites battling to command the allegiance of diaspora communities more closely allied with Palestine. In a highly tendentious document from perhaps the turn of the 9th century, Pirkoi ben Baboy begged the Jews of Kairouan to cast aside their derivation of law from written texts of Mishnah and Talmud, a disturbing practice, he claimed, that they had learned from the Jews of Palestine. Pirkoi, and before him it would seem Yehudai Gaon of 8th century Babylonian Surah, chose to portray Palestine's abandonment of purely oral transmission as a calamity brought about under the hardships of Byzantine rule. While Pirkoi's remarks are more stridently polemical than were those of Shwira Gaon almost 2 centuries later, both attest to the stigma of writing oral traditions that persisted among medieval Jews living in formerly Sasanian lands, and to the transposition of this attitude into a casus belli to advance a change in power relations. When their claims, along with those of Shwira Gaon, are mapped onto a canvas of rabbinic writings stretching back to antiquity, and when they are situated relative to developments in contemporaneous Muslim culture, certain lines of cleavage dividing the medieval Islamicate subcultures of Syria and Iraq can be more clearly seen and better understood. Thank you.
Thank you very much for such a rich paper. Go ahead. I'm on mute. Yeah. Thanks very much for such a rich paper. It's brought up lots of questions in my head, which hopefully I'll have time to ask later. Great. So on to our third speaker. Our third speaker is Dr. Seerwan Hariry, who is a lecturer at Soran University in Iraqi Kurdistan. His research interests span the intersections of language and culture in the context of modern and pre-modern Islamic society, with a focus on literary texts produced by Kurdish writers in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. He received his PhD in Middle Eastern Studies and Cultures from the University of Texas at Austin in 2019, which was funded with a scholarship from the High Committee of Education for Education Development in Iraq. He's currently working on a monograph based on his doctoral work, which focuses on the link between historical trajectories of knowledge construction and trends of nationalism from a literary perspective, particularly in Arabo-Kurdish novels. His paper today, as you can see on the screen, is The Poetics of Multilingualism, Medieval and Pre-Modern Kurdish Poetry, Rethinking Macaronic Verses in Light of Classical Kurdish Poetry. Thank you, Dr. Hariry. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Simon, for your kind introduction. And I would like to thank you, Professor Hany and Professor Huda David. Also, I would like to thank you, my friend, Rawad. Long time no seen, Rawad. For today, I would like to present a case. I have a case under the topic Poetic of Multilingualism in Medieval and Pre-Modern Kurdish Poetry, Rethinking Macaronics in Light of Classical Kurdish Poetry. The anthology of the pre-modern Kurdish poet, Sheikh Reza Talabani. By the way, the sculpture, I'm not sure how much he represents the real character, just for your information. So the anthology of the pre-modern Kurdish poet, Sheikh Reza Talabani, features a literary anecdote in which, quote, a Kurdish scholar happens to ask Talabani, who is the best and the most eloquent poet of all time in Arabic, Kurdish, Persian, and Turkish. Talabani responds that Al-Mutanabbi is the best poet in Arabic. Mustafa Baqi Sahib Quran is also the greatest one in Kurdish. Firdausi is the best poet in Persian, and Namir Kemal is the greatest one in Turkish. However, the best poet in these four languages is your dude, end quote. So he was referring to himself. The significance of this anecdote reveals that the Kurdish poet took pride in producing literary texts in different languages. It also points to two other issues. First, Talabani's critical response to the scholar implies that the latter has glossed over the existence of the polyglot poet in Kurdistan. He should have asked the former, who is the best multilingual poet in his time? Second, being a multilingual character among the Kurdish intelligentsia in the pre-modern Islamic world was something extremely normal. So much so that many of the Kurdish ulama, to put the anthropologist Martin van Brunissen's terminology, were dubbed culture broker, because they learned a subject or a field of knowledge in one part of the Islamic world and taught and introduced it to other people in another part of the region across the Islamic world. So multilingualism was quite popular in the written Kurdish literature during the medieval and pre-modern periods. It makes several appearances in many classical anthologies in the form of macaronic poetry. The term macaronic poetry, coined by an Italian poet, Teofilo Folengo, who mockingly regarded any form of two or more mixed languages as being similar to a certain dough made up of cheese, butter, and flour. So the term has made its way into the Western literary criticism as a way of indicating an entertainment jocular activity. So in the view of the Eurocentric critique, macaronic verses cannot be imagined or justified in any literary body other than as a form of comic or humorous activity. So according to the Penguin Dictionary of Literary Terms and Literary Theory code, the intention in macaronic is nearly always comical or nonsensical. So end quote. The subsequent literary dictionaries and scholarship are in line with the description above. For instance, the concise Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms by Chris Baltic reduces the term macaronic to comic and humorous. So as maintained by the author, quote, macaronic verse is poetry in which two or more languages are mixed together. Strictly, the term denotes a kind of comic verse in which words from a vernacular language are introduced into Latin or other foreign language verses and given Latin inflections, end quote. So in a similar vein, Shemedemo, if I am not mistaken in pronouncing his name, so Shemedemo concludes in his article toward a unified definition of macaronics that The macaronic verse is structured around humorous, burlesque, and satirical content. So in the words of Laura Lonsdale, quote, multilingual writing has strong roots in the comic. So a macaronic tradition where dialects, regionalism, and foreign speech have often been employed in literature to provoke laughter and scorn. So it is consequently not surprising that many multilingual narratives are written in ironic or satirical mode. European scholarship has insufficiently established that language mixing in literary practice is a common characteristics of entertainment. That is, it has nothing to do with seriousness or an earnest genre. However, when we examine the Kurdish macaronic poetry, it does not completely fit in with the most widely known definition given by European critiques. My presentation will explore 4 macaronic poetry collections among dozens of the other collections composed by medieval and pre-modern Kurdish poets, Malay Jaziri, Ahmadi Khani, Nali, Mahwi, whose macaronic verses challenged the views of the European literary critiques by broadening the definition of macaronic poetry to encompass ghazal, the love poetry, panegyric, invective poetry, and other serious topics such as the commitment to the poet's mother tongue. This paper will limit itself to the love poetry due to the time limitation and the degree to which Kurdish macaronic poetry shades a light on the history of multilingualism and multiculturalism in Kurdistan. It will conclude with the claim that Kurdish macaronic verses may have represented an initial step toward normalizing the Kurdish literature in the region, ultimately leading to the emergence of independent Kurdish poetry. So I'm going to begin with the first theme, which is about the ghazal. So ghazal or love poetry appears in several bilingual, trilingual, and quadrilingual poems as a response to the requirements of the post-sociolinguistic context. The Kurdish territory known as Kurdistan has been a space for cultural contact between many ethnic groups and as a zone for linguistic encounters between the languages of 3 empires, Islamic Arabic Safavid, and Ottoman. So the geopolitical position of Kurdistan placed 3 languages, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, at the disposal of Kurdish classical poets. Almost all of the poets were religious intellectuals known as ulama in Arabic or mala in Kurdish. They studied in a mosque and Islamic madrasa in different parts of the Islamic world, and their multilingual output became legitimate part of the Kurdish literary canon. The Kurdish literary canon features various genres in which ghazal could be termed macaronic ghazal, which constitutes the chief part in the Kurdish anthology. So in the following example, Malay Jaziri, for instance, dedicated an entire poem in Arabic, Kurdish, and Persian to the ghazal genre within the Islamic discourse. عيدو هركز جديدارات لي بيروز عيد از تني محروم دیدارم بسط منزل بعيد هر سحر دهنيرم از جانا بآهان راجدل بارك الباري بإسعاد عليها يوم عيد درجه لطفات خانم مال محرومان فدي إن كلبا باسطا دهرا ذرعا بالوسيط كي خلاص از دوزخي هجرة يابم عجفان هر نفس دارد صلاة ونعر هل من مزيد مصحفا حسن جمال سورة خالو ختان ما تلونا غير حرف لا وقرآن مجيد. So it is a Eid. Anyone whom you see would be blessed. I'm the only one who is deprived of seeing you, even in long distances of my soul. Every dawn I painfully pray for you and say, my God bless and render my beloved prosperous in the day of Eid. Oh, lady, would you open the door of your mercy to deprived people? There is a dog stretching his forelegs at the entrance. Oh, young beloved, when will I get rid of the hellfire of your abandon? Every time it shouts, are there any more? in the Quran of your beauty and the chapter of your skin texture, I swear by the Quran, we have not read anything except the word no. So as you can see, the first and the half of the second line, composed in Kurdish, features Jaziri's congratulatory poem to his beloved on it. It also depicts the poet whom informs his beloved about his pain because she has deprived him of dating. So the green colored hemistiches in the second, third, and fifth line are composed in Arabic. They indicate the poet's loyalty to the Islamic tradition by praying an oath expression that imbues the poet with the spirit of one of God's name. When Jaziri makes an appeal for mercy in Kurdish in the first hemistich in the second line, he switched to Arabic in the same line, setting a stage for intertextuality in his ghazal poem to implement culturally driven meaning based on Islam. So he conjures up the image of a dog, which appears in one of the Quranic stories in the chapter of the people of the cave in the Quran. So the poet feels the need to turn to Arabic to appeal a rich imaginary by tracing a similarity between himself and the dog who waited patiently for age for its owner. Invoking God's name and the Quranic expression here is one of the common practices that the medieval and the pre-modern writers followed in their composition in order to endow divine attribution to their writing. This tradition, on the one hand, is well understood by the poem audience, most of whom were supposed to be religious scholars. On the other, it offers a level of unity to the ghazal poetry, particularly between the Kurdish and Arabic hemistiches, in a way that each hemistich completes the meaning of another line in the couplets. As far as the Persian verse is concerned, Jaziri continues to describe his grief as hellfire because he has been left behind by the beloved. Jaziri is seemingly at the behest of his audience. He sees ghazal as an ideal opportunity to spell out his love sickness, but this time in Persian, in the low colored line, in order to prove his linguistic competency in the community of the multilingual speakers in Kurdistan. Jaziri indeed became aware of the need for this type of mixed language between Arabic, Persian, and Kurdish and Persian in his era. He suggests the deficiency of monolingual poetry that often prevented the poet from explicitly putting his imagination into literary form. For instance, in another macaronic ghazal poetry, he implicitly justifies the use of mixed language, complaining that some meanings lack forms of expression and some words cannot completely fit in with some abstract meanings, so that he resorts to different languages in describing his beloved. Dipapusa, samansaye, maneri, bajnubalaye, لعلي أبلغ الأسباب أسباب السماوات جرمزن غمزة شالاكي بدلدي بين إدراكي معان لم يسعها اللفظ من ضيق العبارات. When I kiss her soft feet and look at her body, I may reach the pathways of the heavens. Her gestures and her subtle wings become understood by heart. Some meanings are inexpressible due to the restricted forms of expressions. So here the poem introduces his ghazal in mixed Arabic and Persian in the context of a language barrier, visualizing the linguistic dilemma as performance. Having described the body of his beloved in Kurdish, the poet finds a special use for one of the Quranic verses in his artistic work by taking the Quranic verse out from its religious context and applying it to the description of his beloved. This technique transforms the meaning of the Quranic verse to a pun or double entendre, which ironically gives an erotic implication. Provoking explicit sexual sentiment is scandalous and it is impermissible in Islamic tradition. However, in these macaronic couplets, the religious content in Arabic language finds secular meaning when it appears next to the Kurdish verse. So Jaziri implies that some heading meanings cannot be expressed in a monolingual poem, so that he puts them into a mixed language in order to, on one hand, enrich his forms of expression, and on the other hand, he tends to refrain from being obscene by inciting a sexual connotation in front of his audiences or the readers. So hence, the poet not only shows his erudition in the Islamic context, but he also produces neo-poetic imagery and nuanced meaning that may not exist in his mother tongue. Multilingual poetry functions as a way of signifying the language hierarchy at a regional level. And this hierarchy is signaled especially when each verse of the ghazal poetry displays a certain order in multiple languages. So if you take a look at this, Ahmadi Khani, for instance, ornaments 5 rubaiyat or quatrains in the garment of 4 languages: Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Kurdish. He has a special concern with the trending languages during the medieval Islamic world. One selection of his quatrains is فات عمري في هواك يا حبيبي كل حال نالم حمدمم شد در فراقد ماهو سال قربنم قانن دلرسن شغدن والمشتر هلال دينو أبتر بمجي عشقي من نما عقل كمال أنت فكري في فؤادي أنت روحي في الجسد لشكري غمهايتو ملك دلم ويران كر داد قلدم عشق ألندن اشترم سندن مدد وأنت تران كرني طالان عقل دينو ملك مال. Oh, my darling, your love has destroyed my life consistently. My grief, which lasted for months and years, has become my companion due to your abandon. If you demand my blood, it will be permitted for you. Due to the love, I have lost my mind. I become alone, lacking intelligence and perfection. You are in my mind and my heart, and you are the soul in my body. The army of your sorrow has destroyed the property of my heart. I have become devastated and I need your support. Your Tatars-looking eyes have looted my intelligence, religion, and wealth. So it is a demonstration, it is a demonstration of the creativity of the poet to begin the opening line of his ghazal with Arabic instead of other languages due to its position in the Islamic world. Arabic here should be understood as the poet's top priority in the list of languages in his own time. It reflects its glory and its status in the region during the medieval and pre-modern period. As a religious language, Arabic has opened the door for many non-Arab writers and poets to the Islamic world and its literary canon. The poet assumes that Arabic not only has a bearing on his intellectual life, but it also represented the first language in which ghazal poetry originated. Since ghazal has been used for various purposes due to its connotative potential, its display here accentuates the first secular genre that was brought into non-Arab literature in the Islamic world through the Arabic language. As far as the Persian verse is concerned, it takes the second place in the language ranking. Persian represented the center of gravity of literature for many Kurdish poets who have been captivated by its literary language and its iconic writers such as Sa'di Shīrāzī as an iconic figure in Persian literature. Shīrāzī has become a source of literary inspiration for many Kurdish poets. His poems are vividly intertwined with Kurdish poems. The Turkish insertion in the third line conjures up the hegemony of the Ottoman Empire and signals its transformation from the mere language of administration to one capable of artistic formulation. The Kurdish language takes the last place in the language series to underline its status as a minor language striving for its existing among the aforementioned major languages. Khani exploits the typology of the macaronic verses that display, quote unquote, high literature versus low literature on the body of the poem. He also tends to break taboos around the Kurdish and normalize its emergence among the neighboring languages. Khani makes his bold experiment in the form of Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Kurdish to make room for the Kurdish language in order to be recognized in the body of neighboring languages. Ghazal or love poetry sometimes centers at the heart of macaronic poetry to serve a common word for diversity and inclusiveness. Exploring the multilingual practice in Kurdish poetry signifies the poet's choice of languages. Although Ghazal always underlines a poet's adherence to traditional themes, such as the beauty of beloved, love's pain, the Kurdish Ghazal has a potential to encompass linguistic others. Having announced his unconditional relationship with his beloved, Nali, for instance, pushes the meaning of Ghazal farther by introducing different lexicons in a glossary-like way from different languages to downplay the ethnic discrepancy with his girlfriend. The demand for an intimate relationship with beloved is expressed explicitly in a multilingual exercise. So the poet states, "Mamkhara hawiye hawli firak, dasti min damani to roji qiyam. قال اگر تركي تعال اگر عربي بي اگر كردي اگر فارسي بيار. Do not throw me into the horrified abyss of abandon. I will chase you until the day of the judgment. Come on if you are Turkish. Come on if you are Arab. Come on if you are Kurdish. Come on if you are a Persian figure." As the poet noticed, the activity of glossing the words from the neighboring language reveals the link between polyglossia and diversity in the broad sense of inclusiveness. Despite the linguistic differences, the poet tends to understand the identity of his beloved based on her language in order to find a sense of affiliation and belonging in a diversified society. In fact, knowing the language of the beloved effaces social distances between two speakers, and it has a psychological impact on both. Understanding speakers' differences and accepting his or her differences begins with acknowledging the speaker's mother tongue. Nali displays a practical aspect of communication in a foreign language, aiming to establish a dialogue with the other and featuring the poet's openness toward foreigners. The poet persuasively announces his unconditional love to his girlfriend in different languages as a way of forming a shared identity. For him, multilingualism becomes a site for identity formation, particularly for polyglot lovers who seek to base their relationship based on a common language, which is multilingualism. Nali finds points of agreement between the theme of love and linguistic other. For him, speaking foreign language would never become an obstacle from being identified with other. When he speaks the other's language, he tends to show that he thinks like them, and he sees the world from her linguistic perspective. He also implies that language mixing can be imagined not only as an alternative space for coexistence and assimilation, but also as a linguistic token for cosmopolitan identity. This position shapes our understanding that Kurdistan, on one hand, is treated by the poet as a cosmopolitan place where the poet negotiates the identity of his girlfriend, who has not yet disclosed her place of origin. On the other hand, the poet seemingly composes his poetry in exile, addressing imagined global readers. Nali conjures up his addressee as a cosmopolitan figure living in a cosmopolitan city where all major and minor languages become interconnected in the form of macaronic ghazal in one of the Ottoman Empire cities. The poet reconnects his Kurdish mother tongue to the mother languages, to the major languages, Arabic, Persian, and Kurdish. So Kurdish maintains the trait of being the chief language so that he treats it as a literary platform hosting those three neighboring languages, putting them in translation and dialogue in order to promote the Kurdish languages and to homogenize its literature through the three languages of the empires, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. So on this account, ghazal as a distinct literary genre in Islamic world literature has more potential to be revitalized and give a birth to nuanced meaning, especially when it is linked to the notion of diversity in the context of the classical Kurdish macaronic poetry. Ghazal in macaronic poetry can also be understood as a semiotic gesture by the poet meant to visualize his efforts on the body of poetry, depicting a literary map of the diversity and the borderlines between neighboring languages. Furthermore, a classical Kurdish poet has found a special use of ghazal in his macaronic poetry, in which ghazal becomes the vocal expression of poets' commitment to tradition, religion, and the mother tongue. In contrast to a modern poetry, classical poetry has often been disparaged for its alleged incoherent polythematic verses. A poet often makes a transition in theme, jumping from a topic to another one. However, the Kurdish macaronic are expressed in a new way in order to make appeal to ghazal, in which the poet commits himself to tradition in providing the coherent discourse of self-confession in terms of love, laws, and anxiety. So we have here Mahwi, for instance, opens his ghazal by providing an extra layers of the unity to the macaronic as such. یار از وفا گذشت بر این کشته جفا شد مشدم ز مقدم او روزه صفا چون در قفا دلشدگانش نمیفتن کاکل که من جان دلفگنده بر قفا کردی زبانی اصلا گر ترکی کم بکل با فارسی بکلی امن دب ما بی وفا دوری مبین تو لکریمی بهانجو هرچی که کرد پاکی ببخشه ببول وفا عفوم که یا عفو بحق جاهی او شاها آية علوي جاهي أو آية عفا محمودي في السمايا حبيبي خدايا أو مقبولي بارقاه أو مختار مصطفى صلى عليه إلهنا ما يليق به مع صحبه وآله والأهل ذي الصفا تشويش حال من توز تخليط من بفهم زي أهل زمانه بس كرسات بردلم جفا گفتابوتم وفا طلب از من تو یا محویا در عمر خود شنیده ای از عمر اگر وفا. So I'm going to skip the English to catch up the time. So although the first Persian verses depict Mahwi's grief and lose of his beloved, it suggests his adherence to a literary fashion or vein that exists in Kurdistan. Poets often strive to compose their poetry in the spirit of tradition and the literary taste in Persian. This tradition reminds us of the 20th century notion of iltizam or commitment, in which the poet subscribes to a certain ideology or literary style. Having committed himself to the tradition Persian ghazal, the poet soon makes another commitment toward his mother tongue. This could be a turning point in traditional ghazal, in which a poet makes use of the notion of loyalty not toward his beloved, but this time toward his native language. He accentuates his self-consciousness use of Kurdish as a distinct language, grounding its legitimacy from the use of literary creativity and the elegy of the religious characters in both Kurdish and Arabic. The call to use the Kurdish represents a strong declaration of breaking free from the taboo around the Kurdish language. The last four Persian verses foster nothing but the aesthetic meaning of the macaronic poetry. Arabic, Kurdish, and Persian are used in order to conceptualize the use of mixed language. The poet invites us to believe that macaronic poem has become a distinct symptom arising from a psychology disorder. When the poet's grief reaches its apogee, it is channeled into the mixed language. So thus, the macaronic ghazal serves as a literary commitment, forcing the poet to purposely engage with different languages for different literary motifs and commitments. To conclude, multilingual Kurdish poetry during the medieval and pre-modern periods in the Islamic world is the product of its environment, in which every writer, particularly poets, sees opportunity to confirm a few things. First, mixed language writing is extremely normal in Kurdish literature. It reflects the genuine character of the Kurdish poets who transgress the borderlines of three Islamic empires, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish empires. This attests to our assumption that most Kurdish audiences did not need translation. In a way, each verse in certain language completes the meaning of another verse in opposite language. Second, Kurdish macaronic poetry calls our attention to the fact that ghazal poetry drawn heavily from the imaginary and forms of Arabic, Persian, and Turkish literature developed in those empires. Third, the macaronic poem possesses the literary potential to combine the local language and its cultural elements as a literary itinerary toward literature. Lastly, these macaronic poems become an earnest genre in which the poet displays their pensive mood. Those poems resist becoming just any form of entertainment, which ultimately puts many Western-based literary definitions under a question. Many literary definitions, particularly that of macaronic poetry, need to be revisited and redefined in order to free its content from the regionalism and the ethnic preferences. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't eat over.
Thanks, Seerwan. It was really like a fantastically rich paper, and speaks very directly to Ali's paper, of course, yesterday.
Of course, yeah.
Made me think about some things I've been working on, and made me. I realize now I need to think about them a bit more critically. So thanks very much. It's very thought-provoking. We have gone a bit over. I'm sorry. There were 3 great papers. So I didn't really want to cut people off. Yeah, sorry. I'm not very good at being the very strict chair, but I think it's great to hear this wonderful material. So questions, please use the raise your hand feature or write them in the chat. Hany, what?
Okay, thank you very much for this rich presentation. I have 2 questions. My first question to Nasim, thank you very much for your beautiful presentation. My question about the representation of beloved male in Sufism poetry, Persian poetry. How was use this symbol? My second question, thank you much for your deep paper. My question is, firstly, I see the translation of Saadi al-Fayoumi, the Torah in Arabic was the best introduction. So how was the translation of Saadi al-Fayoumi was received by Jews of Orient?
I don't hear you.
I repeat my question.
Can you? Yes, please. Now.
I repeat my question, Nasim.
Yes, please.
Can you repeat the second question, please?
The second.
For Professor Fishman, my second question about the translation of the Torah by Saadi al-Fayoumi in Arabic. How was this translation in beautiful Arabic was received in Jews of Orient? My second question for Professor Fishman, please, what do you think, why the Jews of Orient or also in Islamic Spain choose the Judeo-Arabic for writing, not Hebrew, not Arabic? Why they choose Judeo-Arabic for writing? Thank you very much.
So the first question for Nasim.
I don't hear anyone. Sorry. Can you write down your question, please?
Yeah, you can.
I repeat for Nasim.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. My internet connection is not stable today, I think. So you just write down your question.
Okay.
So Professor, Talya can.
Okay, I write.
Professor Fishman, do you mind answering the question in the meantime? You're muted, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much, Amina. I think your question points to something very important. Jews of the Islamicate world, whether in Iraq, in North Africa, or in Al-Andalus, did have a kind of diglossia, and they did reserve Hebrew for very specific writings, or Hebrew and Aramaic, I would say, for very specific writings. Aramaic, if it was relating to the rabbinic traditions of the Talmud. But clearly, the Islamic intellectual environment, the pursuit of adab, had seriously influenced the intellectuals of the Jewish world, and they were able to, by using Judeo-Arabic, they had a much larger toolbox with which to analyze and frame their own traditions, examine their own traditions. So you point to something extremely important.
Yeah, that's great. I have a question.
Yes, great. Sorry, Amina, can you write your question for Nasim in the chat, please? So it's there for later. Thanks. Sorry, who had a question? Was it Hany?
Yeah.
Great, yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for this brilliant three presentation. We really loved it and enjoyed it. I think my question will be for Seerwan. First, the term macronic, it actually raised a lot of questions about the European or imposition. I mean, the conceptual untranslatability between the Persian and Turkish and Arabic practice and also the European. And if we break down what we call European, it will be only English, and we don't know even ancient Greek how they dealt with this problem properly. It's the same with the bun. So the bun is the lowest form of humor. So if we say a bun in the Hebrew, studying the bun in the Bible, it's ridiculous. Or studying the bun in Quran, it's the same. So why we keep these terms that mislead the Euro-American readers instead of using indigenous terms? And this is also for Professor Talya, because I'm sure she is dealing with such questions between Arabic and Hebrew and also English. So it's a difficult, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Hany. Actually, I don't have like a concrete answer. Why do like literary critiques keep using like a certain terminology and circulate it within different, academic, journals without, paying attention to the rest of the world? How do we, as like a literary analysis, approach to the same, terminology, for instance? I guess this is part of the hegemony, like that. I guess like Western, canons, specifically like dictionaries, like literary dictionaries that have been, composed by many scholars. All of them belong to the same region and the same field, which is Western, regions. But when this is a very problematic issue for us, I still remember vividly, sometimes when I was a graduate student, I tried to imply certain, terminology or certain concept on certain, theme or concept in Arabic. It was a very conflictive, and it couldn't fit within, so I had to, to make it, work. But when I come across the macronic terminology, and I think even if you take a look at it, etymologically speaking, it doesn't have any the theoretical background. When we compared it to Arab literary critiques who theorize and provide definition to mulamma. And I really appreciate, yes. I appreciate my colleague Ali, who brilliantly put flash to mulamma. So this is a very brilliant gesture here, and I would like to say that the term macaronic was just came out by accident. It doesn't have any theoretical background sitting behind it. So let's the guy like for lingo, the Italian poet just watched a pizza and oh, this is macaroni, my macaroni. So I want to give it a name. So yeah. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. I was just wondering if we can come back to the question for Nasim. Nasim, are you still with us? I'm not sure. No, unfortunately, I think we lost her. Okay. Are there any? Maybe we should be wrapping up now. Unfortunately, I have lots of questions, so I think I might have to send them to you separately, if that's okay. To both of you, well, to all three of you. Nasim.
Sorry, Simon. So I have a quick answer for Amina.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
great.
how was the beloved male used in Sufi Persian poetry? Well, you should definitely read different Sufi Persian poetry to get to that answer, because every poet has its own different, different description or different adjectives that they use for their male beloved. Like, for example, Ḥāfeẓ uses a Shīrīn, for example, sweet, or they sometimes they compare them to the sky and like powerfulness and but you should definitely read a lot of Sufi poems to see that how they describe their male lover or their beloved male.
That's great.
Thank you very much. That's great. If I thanks again to all the to all three presenters. Really fantastic papers. I think everyone has enjoyed them a lot.
Yes,
not
thank you
just
so much.
included.
Thank you so
I'm just going
much.
to hand over to Hany.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simon, and thank you, Seerwan, Nasim, and Professor Talya. They were really brilliant. I think now we will go for the last session.